Hello, everyone, and good morning. Welcome to part 5 of our 6-part series on recognizing impermanence. So, this morning, Bhante Suddhaso will be sharing some words of Dhamma on the theme of impermanence. And if at any time you have any questions, feel free to type them in the live chat and we'll address them at the end. Good morning so far to Gita, Jnana, and Michael. Who says, "Good morning, impermanent beings." And hello to all our friends who are watching, but lurking, as we say, on the internet. And we can pass things over to Bhante Suddhaso for some words of Dhamma.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassam. Good morning, friends. So I'll be speaking a little bit more about the practice of recognizing impermanence. And yesterday I spoke about it in a systematic way. So progressively moving through the 5 physical senses and then gradually deepening through layers of the mind. But as you may have discovered if you've been experimenting with this method, is that the actual experience is not necessarily so mathematical. It's not necessarily so algorithmically precise. The actual experience is much more like life, messy, unpredictable, unfolding in ways that are unexpected, in ways which don't necessarily fit the frameworks that you learn in school. So it's the same with the recognition of impermanence. In actuality, whatever's impermanent is just whatever your mind is currently pointed at. Whatever attention is currently directed towards, that's what's impermanent. That's what's recognized to be insubstantial, illusory, substanceless, essenceless. So it's not necessarily a requirement to do a step-by-step meditation of gradually moving through the components of body and mind. Though if that's helpful, of course, you can do that. But often it's just a matter of, in each moment, see what the mind is pointing at, recognize wherever attention is going, and recognize that wherever attention is going is impermanent. Whatever the mind is pointed at is impermanent. So if right now the mind is pointed at the sound of the crickets, well, that's impermanent. If right now the mind is pointed at the feeling of your hands in your lap, well, that's impermanent. If right now it's pointed at that mild sense of irritation in your mind, well, that's impermanent. Ayasoma laughs because she's a fellow aversion type. So we both know what it's like to have this persistent, seemingly persistent feeling of irritation in the mind. You wake up and you're like, I hate this. And you go into morning puja, I hate this. And it's breakfast time, I hate this. And it's break time, I hate this too. You have some tea, I hate this. You come in for the Dhamma talk, I hate this. This is just what life is like for a hate type. And that's actually quite uncomfortable, by the way. So I was thinking about this the other day, because it's often a little bit difficult for non-hate types to relate to hate types because they're like, why are these people so mean all the time? But it's not that we're mean all the time. It's that we're struggling with this bizarre self-destructive habit of hating everything that we encounter. And we're actually fully aware that it's uncomfortable. We're fully aware that it makes life difficult for ourselves and for everybody around us. But it's so hard to stop. And also, it actually does feel a little bit good, I can't deny. There's something like sickly sweet about hating everything you encounter. You can relate. She says it's like smoking cigarettes. I disagree. I hate smoking too. Anyway, tangent, because hating things is also impermanent. Every now and then, I look at the mind and I'm like, wow, I actually don't hate anything right now. So that's also impermanent. Every now and then I look at the mind and I'm like, wow, I'm actually not irritable in this moment. I'm not grumpy right now. There's no grumpiness in the mind right now. It actually feels kind of nice. It actually feels really nice. So it's whatever the mind is pointed at. So whether, again, it's a sensation like the sound of the crickets or the feeling of your hands, an emotion, sadness, happiness, grumpiness, a thought drifting through the mind, a memory, an idea, whatever it is. Whatever the mind lands on in each moment, recognize that the mind has landed on something that's impermanent. It's landed on something which actually can't be landed on because there's not really anything there. The moment we try to identify what we've landed on, it's already changed. There's already something else in its place. So with this practice, then, it's actually not necessary to try to force the mind to go through a step-by-step process. It's a little bit like playing hopscotch in a lava field. You're like, well, I put my foot here. Ah, that's hot. It burns. I put my foot here. Ah, that's hot. It burns. I put my foot here. Ah, that's hot. It burns. Well, it's the same. You put your mind here. Ah, it's impermanent. Can't land there. Put your mind there. Ah, it's impermanent. I can't stick there either. Put your mind here. Ah, that's impermanent. I can't settle down there either. There's nowhere the mind can settle because wherever the mind tries to settle, you just immediately see, oh, that's impermanent. It has no substance to it. It has no stable, lasting reality. So there's no way the mind can settle there. There's no way the mind can stick there because there's nothing to settle on. There's nothing to stick to. So in this way, the mind will hop around for a while until eventually the mind realizes that it's trying to hop from nothing to nothing. And eventually the mind just gives up and starts to settle into samadhi. So this is one of the ways that vipassana can lead to samadhi. So I don't normally talk about this approach. Normally I talk about first developing samadhi, and then after the mind is well collected, well focused, well unified, to then practice vipassana, to then practice insight meditation of various sorts. But this is one way where one can start with using a vipassana method, which is, in this case, the recognition of impermanence, recognizing that whatever the mind tries to land on is impermanent and insubstantial, and using that as an inroad to the development of samadhi. So again, as the mind eventually starts to realize that whatever it's trying to land on is impermanent and insubstantial and essenceless and groundless and impossible to stand on, then eventually it stops trying to stand on anything. It stops trying to hop from thing to thing because it recognizes there's no things to hop from, no things to hop to. And so the mind stops hopping, it stops jumping around, it stops flailing around, and it starts to settle into unification. So as the mind settles into unification, as it collects itself into samadhi, then you have a couple of choices. One is actually to continue with that, to focus on samadhi, to focus on gathering and unifying the mind. Or you can actually just continue to recognize the impermanence of whatever the mind is currently experiencing. Because actually that process of unifying the mind is a series of impermanent experiences. So in the beginning, the mind is very dispersed and scattered. Well, that's impermanent, isn't it? Because the mind is starting to collect together. The next moment, the mind is maybe 10% collected, 90% scattered. Well, that's also impermanent. That's also changing. That's not the station of the mind. That's just another temporary experience, which has no lasting reality. then maybe the mind goes up to 20% unified, 80% scattered. Again, that's impermanent. That's just another substanceless thing for the mind to not land on. So even as the mind collects into samadhi, even if you enter all the way into complete samadhi, even if you enter all the way into first jhana, which is possible, if you let the mind be still, it's possible, then that also is impermanent. That also is subject to change. So one of my favorite suttas in the canon is the Atthika Nagara Sutta. Atthika Nagara Sutta, it's in the Majjhima Nikaya. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. No. I remember the titles, but not the numbers most of the time. The Atthika Nagara Sutta, the discourse to the man from the city named Atthika Nagara, Atthika city. It's not the most exciting name. It's kind of like calling it the Denver Sutta. It's the sutta to the man from Denver. So Atthika Nagara Sutta means the discourse to the man from Atthika city. Anyway, the Atthika Nagara Sutta, it's giving a list of 11 ways of attaining enlightenment. And very first one on the list, enter first jhana and recognize that it's impermanent. And if you do that with complete sincerity, then the mind will break through all the way to full enlightenment. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? It's not. It's straightforward, but like everything else in Buddhism, it's straightforward but difficult. We also have things which are complicated and difficult, by the way. But most of Buddhist practice is straightforward but very difficult. So once the mind is entered into samadhi, then you recognize that also the experience of samadhi is impermanent. The qualities and characteristics of mind, when it's unified and stabilized and concentrated, that also is impermanent. The appearance of stability is a mere appearance. It's not a reality. It's just another ephemeral phenomenon. It's just another thing which we can't settle on because it's not something that can be settled on. It's kind of like the old story of the person who tried to build a house in the swamp. Spend all day building the house, and during the night it just sinks into the swamp because there's no solid ground there. It's just swamp. And the person tries again and again, and the house just keeps sinking. There's nothing for it to stand on. So that's actually what we're doing every moment. Every moment we try to build our house on this moment. We try to build our house on this experience of body-mind in this moment, but that's like trying to build your house in a swamp. We try to build our sense of self on the swamp of this present moment. There's nothing for the mind there's nothing for the sense of self to solidly stand on. There's no foundation for it. But we keep trying anyway because we're so desperately attached to this idea of building a house in the swamp. So desperately attached to this idea of building a self-identity on body-mind. So we keep trying over and over and over again, even though it keeps not working. It keeps failing, but we keep trying. That's utterly futile. And of course, it's not perfect because in the story, then the person goes and builds their house on dry land. And the reason this isn't a perfect metaphor is because there is no dry land in reality. It's all swamp. There is no solid ground that you can build your self-identity on. Can't be found. The only thing that approaches solid ground is nibbana. And I've got some bad news for you. There's no self-identity in nibbana. There's no way to build self-identity on nibbana. It's actually mentioned in the Mullapariyaya Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 1. This is one where I actually remember the number. The Mullapariyaya Sutta, the Buddha actually mentions the danger of trying to build a sense of self on nibbana. And he points out how it's impossible. It's absurd. It can't be done. That just comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what nibbana is. Through not understanding it, we form concepts of it and we build a sense of self around it. So there's nothing whatsoever which provides a solid foundation for building a sense of self-identity. Nothing at all. So this is one of the things which can sometimes happen as we get deep into samadhi, in particular. The mind starts to feel very solid, starts to feel very stable. And there's actually a number of accounts in the suttas of people who did get into deep states of samadhi, and their mind felt very stable and solid, and they thought, oh, this is my true self. This is my true nature. I've discovered my true nature. But the Buddha says, no, that's not your true nature either. That's just another temporary, ephemeral, impermanent experience. It's just another part of the swamp. But it's a part of the swamp that looks deceptively like solid ground, looks deceptively like dry land. But it's not. It's still swampy ground, just like everything else in the swamp. So this is something to look out for. As the mind unifies into samadhi, it can seem like we're discovering solid ground. But always look more closely. Recognize that samadhi also is impermanent, unstable, ephemeral, subject to change, seen to arise and cease. We enter it and we leave it. And this is one thing which is notable about the attainment of full awakening, which I can't speak about from personal experience, full disclaimer. The attainment of full awakening is finally the discovery of that which does not arise and cease. It's finally the discovery of that which cannot be said to be impermanent, which is, in fact, nibbana, the unconditioned, that which is not made up of things, that which is not made up of objects, that which is not made up of conditions or circumstances. But that's so far outside the domain of our ordinary experience that most of us, we can't even conceptualize such a thing. And in fact, if we did conceptualize it, that would be wrong because it would just be a concept. And Nibbana is not a concept. It's beyond concepts. Concepts are things. So they have no grounding in the absolute. So until we realize the absolute, every single thing we experience is impermanent. Every single thing we experience is subject to change. Every single thing we experience is insubstantial. So as the mind collects and unifies into samadhi, it can develop a laser-sharp precision where increasingly subtle phenomena become clear to the mind. Kind of like turning up the power on a microscope. You can gradually see smaller and smaller things, more and more minute things. So more and more minute aspects of our physical experience can start to become intimately familiar with the tiniest parts of your body, which is a really bizarre experience if you've never done this before. But perfectly normal, as it turns out. We're actually feeling all the parts of our body all the time anyway. We're just oblivious to most of it because we don't pay enough attention. The sensations are all here. We're just not bothering to look at them. And also you can become increasingly aware of the most subtle and minute movements of mind. And this is what's really interesting. So I spoke yesterday a little bit about layers of mind. So this is something which I bring up from time to time. Normally we recognize that there's the outermost layer of mind, so very coarse mental activities, coarse mental objects, discursive thought is kind of the classic aspect of the coarse layer of mind. Visual imagery in the mind fits in there as well. Very strong emotions fit in there as well. And then beneath that, we have slightly more subtle things, nonverbal mental phenomena, more subtle emotions. And then working beneath that, we have the general mood of the mind, general attitude of the mind. These are all things which pretty much anyone, whether they're a Buddhist practitioner or not, pretty much anyone has some awareness of these top three layers of mind. It's pretty hard to miss these things. Some people, they actually do miss it and they only catch the outermost layer, just the really coarse, obvious thoughts and the really, really strong emotions. Some people, that's all they notice. But generally speaking, it doesn't take too much to see these top 3 layers of mind. So coarse thoughts, coarse emotions, more subtle emotional layer, and then the basic mood or attitude of the mind. So 3 outermost layers. But as we become increasingly aware with more refined, precise attention to the mind, then we start to recognize that beneath those 3 top layers is this vast depth. And that vast depth is not still. That vast depth is filled with movement. So we're constantly moving the mind, and we're moving the mind in, first off, nonverbal ways. Again, verbal thought only forms the outermost layer of the mind. Everything beneath that is nonverbal. And actually, once you get below those top couple layers of mind, it's not only nonverbal, it's also, it's not visual. There's no visual component to it. So it's on the layer of feeling, but it's strictly mental feeling. So it's not words, it's not images. It's just feeling, like you're groping through a dark room. It's just on the layer of feeling the movement of mind. And these movements of mind can be incredibly subtle, incredibly minute. Again, things that we normally don't notice at all, like twitching and throbbing in the mind. That's what it can feel like. But all that twitching and throbbing in the mind is actually what creates the substrate for the coarse layers of mind. It's what creates the basic fundamental patterns for the coarse experiences of mind. A bit like how with a computer, or actually any electronic device these days for that matter, whether it's a smartphone or a tablet or whatever, you turn it on and there's images and words appearing on the screen. But actually, if you're much familiar with how computers work, you know that's only the outermost layer of the functioning of the computer. Beneath that, you've got programming code, which actually looks roughly like words. In fact, it often contains lots of words as well as lots of weird, arcane symbols, which the average non-coder has no clue what they mean. Even a lot of the words don't make any sense to non-coders. But then beneath that, you start to get into machine language, which is even more abstruse and nearly impossible to understand. But then eventually you get down to the layer of zeros and ones, where everything is just this string of zeros and ones. So at that level, it's extremely simple, it's extremely basic, but it's also extremely abstruse. It's very difficult to get any clear understanding of what that's building up to. But all those little zeros and ones build up to the experience of videos and words and books and ideas and communication and all of that on the surface level of the computer's operation. Well, it's similar with the mind. So all this subtle twitching and throbbing and flailing that happens deep beneath the surface of mind is like the zeros and ones of a computer. It's creating the basic internal language through which we see the operation of moods, emotions, words, memories, imagery, and so on. It's what's basically creating the experience of self, the experience of body-mind, which we identify as self. And since we aren't aware of those layers of mind most of the time, then we don't even recognize that all of that also is impermanent, insubstantial, ephemeral, essenceless, impersonal, not who we are, arbitrary. So it's starting to shine the light down into all of those dark areas of mind, starting to bring awareness to all of that twitching that we're doing beneath the surface of the mind. And it's the recognition that we're doing it. All of that twitching that's going on, those are patterns that we put there. Those are patterns that we put in place, patterns of mental activity that we created, that we established. Which means that we have the ability to choose to do something else with the mind. We have the ability to put other patterns in place. And we can recognize that the patterns which are currently going on are arbitrary. They're subject to change, which means they're not who we are. Things can be other than that. But it's also recognizing that these deeper layers of mind, which normally seem solid and unchangeable, are in fact not solid. And they are changeable. In fact, they're changing all the time. So I think that's the main thing I wanted to bring up for today. So kind of wandered through a number of different topics there. But the main one I wanted to bring up was the flexibility of this practice of recognizing impermanence. So it doesn't need to be a systematic step-by-step, though for some people that's exactly how they like to practice and what gets the best results for them. But for other people, it's actually quite helpful to just let it be whatever the mind tries to land on, see it as impermanent. Nothing the mind can land on. Just watching as the mind bounces from something it can't land on to something else it can't land on, to something else it can't land on, and on and on and on and on. And eventually, in this way, the mind starts to settle down and to look more deeply at itself, to look more deeply at that habit of jumping around, to look more deeply at the underlying assumptions behind that jumping around in search of dry land, some deeper understanding of what's going on there. So I think that's all I have to say for this morning. So thank you for your attention, assuming you paid attention, because attention is, after all, impermanent. And if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and enter them in, and we'll discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So there's no questions just yet. We do have a couple more people joining us. Sandeep, as well as Louise Emmanuel. And Elaine saying good morning. And I hope everyone's benefiting from this retreat. Thank you, Bhante. Gita also says thank you. Michael says, thank you for emphasizing the importance of developing samadhi. This hits directly to me. I usually move quickly from samadhi to vipassana practice, often before I'm ready.
Okay, that's it.
And there's no other questions or comments so far, so this may be an early morning. Okay, so if there are no other questions or comments, then you can join us for the last chanting, meditation, and talk on this topic tonight at 7:30. And if you have any lingering questions on impermanence, you can ask them at that time. But for today, we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.